August 2nd, 1920, Boston, Massachusetts. It is 7 in the morning, and already the streets outside a small office building on School Street are packed. Not with protesters, not with a parade, with ordinary people, factory workers, widows, Italian immigrants, mailmen, teachers, all clutching envelopes stuffed with cash. They are not being robbed. They are volunteering. They want to hand their life savings to a single man, a man most of them have never met, a man who arrived in this country 17 years ago with $2.50 in his pocket. His name is Charles Ponzi, and in 8 months he has collected more money than the city of Boston keeps in its treasury. How does a man, no degree, no banking license, no product, no service, convince an entire nation to give him everything they have? The answer is more disturbing than you think, because it wasn't greed alone that broke these people. It was hope. To understand the con, you first have to understand the man behind it. Charles Ponzi was born in 1882 in Lugo, a quiet town in northern Italy. His family had once known better days, old money, old pride. But by the time Charles arrived, that world was gone. His father was a postman. The house was small, the meals were often thin. But his mother, Imelda, refused to let Charles forget what the family once was. She dressed him in clothes the family couldn't afford. She spoke of their noble past the way other mothers spoke of fairy tales. Every morning she planted a seed in her son's mind. You are not like the others. You were made for something greater. That seed would grow into something monstrous. At the University of Rome, surrounded by sons of real wealth, Charles spent money he didn't have trying to look like a man he wasn't. He gambled, he drank, he entertained. And then one morning he woke up with nothing. No degree, no money, no plan. So he did what dreamers with empty pockets often do. He looked west. In 1903, Ponzi boarded the SS Vancouver and crossed the Atlantic. His family had scraped together their remaining savings to send him. The new world, they believed, could redeem the family name. It nearly killed the dream before it began. On the ship, he gambled. Again. By the time the Boston coastline appeared through the morning fog, he had lost almost everything. He stepped off that boat with $2.50. $2.50. For the next several years, Ponzi became invisible, a ghost moving through the margins of American life. He washed dishes in restaurant kitchens. He swept floors. He learned English by listening to the men he served. He moved from Boston to New York to Pittsburgh and back again, always chasing something just out of reach. But here's what nobody tells you about those years. They didn't break Charles Ponzi. They educated him. He wasn't studying books. He was studying people. Specifically, he was studying what makes ordinary, rational human beings do irrational things. What he discovered would eventually make him the most dangerous man in America. In 1907, Ponzi crossed the border into Canada, Montreal, a city full of Italian immigrants, men and women just like him, hard workers who'd crossed an ocean for a better life. He found work at a small bank called Banco Zarossi, run by a charming Milanese named Luigi Zarossi. The bank catered exclusively to the Italian community. And Zarossi had a secret weapon. He offered 6% interest on deposits, at a time when other banks offered 2%. The Italian laborers of Montreal trusted this man completely. He was one of them. He spoke their language. He understood their fears. And he was robbing them blind. Ponzi figured it out within weeks. Zerosi wasn't generating profits. He was paying old depositors using the money of new ones. The moment deposits slowed, the whole thing would collapse. And when it did, Zerosi packed a bag, grabbed whatever cash was left in the vault, and disappeared to Mexico. He didn't even say goodbye to his own wife. Left alone in the wreckage of that office, Ponzi could have walked away disgusted. Instead, he sat very still and had a single world-altering thought. The model didn't fail because it was wrong. It failed because Zerosi panicked too soon. He filed that lesson away. He would use it later. And he would not panic. Before he could use that lesson, Ponzi's desperation got ahead of him. He forged a check. Got caught. Spent 3 years in a Canadian prison. Then, after that, he tried to smuggle Italian immigrants illegally across the American border and ended up in a federal prison in Atlanta for 2 more years. Most people focus on the crime. Nobody focuses on what happened inside those walls. In Atlanta, Ponzi shared cells and corridors with some of the most sophisticated criminal minds of the era, men who had swindled banks, railroads, and governments. Men who understood at a molecular level how trust works and how to manufacture it. Ponzi absorbed all of it, not just tactics, but psychology. He learned that the most effective cons don't target stupid people. They target smart ones. Because smart people, once convinced, convince others. Smart people don't admit they were fooled. Smart people double down. When he walked out of that prison in 1912, he looked exactly the same. Same face, same slight build, same mustache. But inside, something fundamental had changed. He was no longer a man looking for a shortcut. He was a man who understood the architecture of human desire. Back in Boston by 1917, Ponzi took a small job at an import-export company. And there, through the ordinary magic of shared lunches and polite conversation, he met Rose Necco. She was 21, he was 35. She was grounded, gentle, and completely unaware of the storm she was walking into. They married quickly, and for a brief window, a few quiet years running her father's small grocery, Ponzi came closer to a normal life than he ever had before or would again. Rose didn't need luxury. She needed honesty. She told him so in her simple, direct way. Less money, more peace. He heard her, and then he stopped listening. The grocery failed, the debts piled up, and Charles Ponzi, a man who had spent 37 years running from poverty, felt the walls closing in again. It was in this desperate state, in the autumn of 1919, that a small piece of paper arrived from Spain. It would change everything. The paper was called an International Reply Coupon. Tiny, unremarkable, designed simply to let people in one country prepay for postage stamps in another. Here's how it worked. You bought a coupon in Italy for 1 cent because the Italian lira had collapsed after World War I, and you could exchange it in the United States for a 5-cent stamp. On paper, that's a 400% return. Most people would read that sentence and move on. Ponzi read it and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Now, here is the part the story always glosses over. The part that makes Ponzi genuinely brilliant, not just lucky. He knew the arbitrage didn't really work at scale. He did the math. The logistics of physically moving millions of coupons across borders, exchanging them, converting stamps to cash, it would eat the profit entirely. But that didn't matter, because he wasn't going to trade coupons. He was going to sell the idea of trading coupons. There's a difference, a catastrophic, civilization-shaking difference. In December 1919, Charles Ponzi opened the Securities Exchange Company in a single rented room on School Street, Boston. He had no staff, no furniture beyond a desk and a chair, and an offer that sounded too good to be true, because it was. Invest with me. I will return 50% profit in 45 days. Double your money in 90. The first investors were skeptical. Of course they were. So Ponzi targeted a small group, a dozen men from his own community. He paid them early, with interest, in cash. They told their brothers told their neighbors told their co-workers. This is the mechanism nobody ever explains properly. Ponzi wasn't selling a financial product. He was engineering social proof. Every person who got paid became an unpaid salesman. And unlike a newspaper advertisement, a friend handing you a stack of real money is nearly impossible to argue with. By February 1920, he was taking in $5,000 a day. By March, $30,000. By July, at the absolute peak, he was pulling in $250,000 every single day in $1920. The office on School Street couldn't contain it. Staff were hired and then overwhelmed. Cash was stored in wastepaper baskets, literally, wastepaper baskets stuffed with bills shoved under desks because the drawers were already full. People mortgaged their homes. Policemen pooled their salaries. Priests invested church funds. A group of factory workers collected their wages on Friday and handed the entire sum to Ponzi's office before they went home. These were not foolish people. These were people who had spent their entire lives being told that wealth was impossible for people like them, and here, finally, was a man who said, "Not anymore." That's what Ponzi sold. Not returns, not coupons. He sold the feeling of winning in a world that had always made them lose. By the summer of 1920, Charles Ponzi had become something no immigrant, no Italian, no working-class dreamer had ever become in America. A celebrity. He wore hand-tailored suits from the finest Boston tailors. He bought a 16-room mansion in Lexington, the wealthiest suburb in Massachusetts, complete with air conditioning, a heated pool, and a staff of servants. He bought Rose a fur coat and a diamond ring. He installed gold-plated bathroom fixtures. He smoked his cigarettes with a cane holder, just to take longer drawing them. Newspapers called him the Wizard of Boston. The Boston Post ran breathless profiles. A Massachusetts congressman publicly suggested that Ponzi should be appointed to run the United States Treasury. And here is the detail that nobody ever mentions. Ponzi himself began to believe it. There are accounts from people who knew him during this period who say something had shifted in his eyes. He no longer spoke about the scheme as a trick. He spoke about it as destiny, as though the universe had finally recognized what his mother always knew. That is the most dangerous moment in any fraud, when the con man starts drinking his own poison. His name was Clarence Barron, 61 years old, 400 pounds, and one of the most respected financial journalists in the United States, the founder of what would later become Barron's magazine. He read the profiles of Charles Ponzi and felt the particular discomfort of a man who actually understands money. Something is wrong here. He began asking questions that nobody in Boston's financial press had thought to ask. Simple questions. Devastating questions. If Ponzi is making these returns from international reply coupons, how many coupons is he trading? Barron calculated. At the volume of investment Ponzi had taken in, he would need approximately 160 million coupons in active circulation. The total number of international reply coupons in circulation worldwide at that moment was 27,000. The Boston Post published Barron's findings on July 26, 1920. The next morning, the line outside Ponzi's office was not investors wanting in. It was investors wanting out. This is the moment where Charles Ponzi separates himself from every other con man in history. This is why his name is in the dictionary and theirs are not. When the crowd gathered outside his office, angry, terrified, shouting for their money, Ponzi did not hide. He did not flee. He did not send lawyers. He walked outside. He had coffee and fresh pastries brought out for the crowd. He moved through the people personally, shaking hands, patting shoulders, telling jokes in Italian to the old men who'd trusted him. He looked them directly in the eye and said simply, "If you want your money, you will have it. Every penny, right now. But I'm not a thief. I'm a businessman. And I am asking you to trust me a little longer." Within 3 days, he paid back over $2 million in cash. In cash. And something remarkable happened. Many of the people who had come to take their money back handed it straight back to him. Because when you watch a man pay $2 million in 3 days without blinking, the newspaper article starts to seem like the lie. It was the single most audacious act of psychological manipulation in the history of American finance, and it bought him 6 more weeks. But the clock had run out. State authorities ordered an immediate audit. New investments were frozen, and the moment new money stopped flowing in, the mechanism broke, because there had never been any other mechanism. The audit results were published on August 12, 1920. Charles Ponzi was insolvent by approximately $7 million. Against that deficit, the assets in his name, the mansion, the cars, the jewelry, the bank accounts, covered almost nothing. There was no IRC trading operation. There never had been. Not one coupon had ever been purchased. 40,000 people had invested with him. Many of them, the ones who invested early and reinvested their profits, lost everything. Factory workers, elderly widows, immigrant families who had saved for 20 years. The total amount taken, approximately $20 million. In today's money, somewhere north of 300 million. On the day of his arrest, Charles Ponzi walked to the police car without being dragged. He straightened his jacket, adjusted the flower in his lapel, and stepped in as though it were a limousine. "I went looking for trouble," he later said, "and I found it." He served 5 years on federal charges. Then Massachusetts hit him with 22 additional counts. He served more time. He appealed. He lost. But even in prison, even broken, even exposed, the hustle never stopped. On bail between sentences in the 1920s, he launched a Florida land scheme. He sold swamp property as prime real estate, promising 200% returns in 60 days. He was caught again. At one point, facing rearrest, he faked his own suicide, left his clothes on a bridge near Jacksonville with a note, shaved his head, grew a beard, took a job as a cook on a cargo ship under a false name, planning to disappear into Italy and start again. He almost made it. The ship's crew recognized him. Federal agents were waiting at the dock. What this tells you is something important about people like Charles Ponzi. It was never about the money. Not really. The money was just the proof. Proof that he was extraordinary. Proof that his mother was right. The moment the money was gone, he needed a new proof, and then another. In 1934, after serving out his final sentence, Charles Ponzi was deported. He was 52 years old. He had spent roughly a third of his adult life behind bars. Rose had finally left him. The woman who had loved him quietly and completely, who had asked only for honesty, who had stood beside him through scandal and prison and public humiliation, she filed for divorce. She would later say she never stopped loving the man she thought she'd married. She just eventually accepted he had never existed. Ponzi went back to Italy first, tried to work for Mussolini's government, was removed for dishonesty, which, when you consider who Mussolini was, is a remarkable sentence to write. He moved to Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, worked as a translator, then as a low-level airline agent for Alitalia, lived in a small room, told almost no one who he was. In 1948, a reporter tracked him down. Ponzi was 66, partially blind. A stroke had paralyzed half his face. He had almost nothing. The reporter asked him if he had any regrets. Ponzi thought for a moment, and then he smiled that same smile that had once convinced 40,000 people to trust him. "Even the people who lost money," he said, "got something for it. I gave them the greatest show on earth. For $15 million, that seems like a reasonable ticket price." He died in January 1949 in a charity hospital. The Brazilian government paid for his burial. The coffin was plain wood. He left behind $75. In 2008, a 70-year-old man named Bernie Madoff was arrested in New York. His fraud had run for nearly 40 years and consumed $65 billion, the largest financial fraud in recorded history. 3 times the size of Enron. Every journalist, every prosecutor, every economist reached for the same word: Ponzi. Not because Madoff studied Charles Ponzi, though he likely did, but because the structure of the fraud was identical. New money paying old obligations. The promise of impossible returns. Social proof doing the marketing. And at the center, a man who needed desperately to be believed. In India, the Sahara Group collected billions from rural investors with promises of high returns. The Saradha scheme in Bengal collapsed in 2013, wiping out the savings of nearly 2 million people, many of them daily wage workers who had trusted a man in a good suit. In Pakistan, in Nigeria, in China, in the United States, every decade, in every country, the scheme reappears. Different name, different product, same architecture. Why does it keep working? Because the vulnerability Ponzi exploited isn't stupidity. It's not even greed. It's the very human, very reasonable desire to believe that the rules don't always have to be stacked against you, that someone, somewhere, has found a door in the wall. Charles Ponzi found that desire, and he weaponized it. He showed the world that you don't need capital to steal a fortune. You only need to understand what people are afraid of losing. He arrived in America with $2.50. He left behind a concept so durable, so perfectly engineered, that economists named it after him permanently. In the end, Charles Ponzi got exactly what his mother always wanted for him. He became unforgettable.